The rotting floorboards groaned under Jake's boots as he stepped into the abandoned cabin perched on Eagle's Ridge, 3,000 feet above the nearest town. Broken windows stared like dead eyes, and 20 years of mountain storms had turned his grandfather's dream home into a nightmare of collapsed beams and water damage. But Jake wasn't just any 17-year-old. He was the grandson of Marcus the Builder Thompson, the legendary craftsman who could raise a barn in half the time it took other men. Hidden beneath a loose stone in the fireplace, Jake found his grandfather's leather journal filled with sketches of an impossible building technique. The pages spoke of borrowed time and warned that they're still watching. As Jake studied the cryptic blueprints, shadows moved outside the broken windows. Someone had been waiting for him to return. The cabin wasn't just falling apart, it was hiding something worth killing for. But what secret could an old mountain builder have discovered that was dangerous enough to bury? Jake's fingers traced the weathered leather cover, feeling the deep grooves where his grandfather's calloused hands had worn the surface smooth. The journal felt warm against his palm, almost alive. He'd driven 6 hours from Denver after the lawyer handed him the deed, expecting nothing more than a weekend project and maybe some closure. His grandfather had vanished when Jake was 12, leaving behind only rumors and this crumbling monument to broken dreams. The first page made his breath catch. Marcus's distinctive handwriting sprawled across yellowed paper. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and they've finally stopped hunting me long enough for you to find this place. The technique isn't just about building fast, Jake. It's about building with the mountain itself." A floorboard creaked behind him. Jake spun around, heart hammering but saw only dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. The silence pressed against his eardrums like a physical weight. He was alone up here. Had to be. The nearest neighbor lived 15 miles down a road that barely deserved the name. He turned back to the journal, flipping through pages covered in diagrams that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. The sketches showed joints that shouldn't have been possible, wood bending in ways that defied physics and measurements, that used symbols he'd never seen in any construction manual. "The old ways aren't dead," one entry read. "The mountain remembers how things were built before machines, before permits, before they decided some knowledge was too dangerous. But the mountain also remembers those who would abuse its gifts." Jake's skin crawled. His grandfather had always been eccentric, talking to trees and reading weather patterns like tea leaves, but this felt different, paranoid, desperate. A shadow fell across the journal's pages. Jake looked up to see a figure silhouetted in the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a jacket that had seen better decades. The man's face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but something about his stance made Jake's muscles tense. "You Marcus's boy?" The voice carried the rough edges of a lifetime spent breathing mountain air. His grandson. Jake closed the journal slowly, casually, hoping the man hadn't seen what he was reading. Jake Thompson. Figured as much. Got the look of him. The stranger stepped inside without invitation, his boots finding the solid beams beneath the rotted flooring with practiced ease. "Name's Ezra. I own the land down the ridge." Jake nodded, though something felt off. The lawyer had mentioned the cabin's isolation, not neighboring properties. "Nice to meet you." Ezra's laugh held no warmth. "Your grandfather and we had an understanding. He kept to his business, I kept to mine. Worked out real well for both of us." "What kind of business?" "The kind that's best left buried." Ezra's gaze fixed on the journal in Jake's hands. "Found some of his old papers, did you?" Marcus always was one for writing things down, probably just ramblings. Man got a bit touched toward the end. The way he said it made Jake's skin crawl. There was something hungry in Ezra's voice, something that made Jake want to put distance between them. "Just construction notes," Jake said. "Nothing interesting. Mind if I take a look? Might help me understand some of the strange things that happened up here over the years." Jake tucked the journal inside his jacket. "Actually, I should get going. Long drive back to Denver." Ezra's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. But Jake?" He paused at the doorway. Some secrets are buried for good reason. Your grandfather learned that lesson the hard way. Be a shame if history repeated itself. The threat hung in the air like smoke. After Ezra disappeared into the trees, Jake stood frozen for a long moment, his grandfather's warnings echoing in his mind. They're still watching. He wasn't leaving, not yet. Whatever Marcus had hidden up here, whatever had gotten him killed, because Jake was suddenly certain his grandfather hadn't simply vanished, he was going to find it. The mountain kept its secrets well, but Jake was a Thompson, and Thompsons didn't back down from a challenge. The rusty key turned with surprising ease, as if the lock had been waiting 17 years for this exact moment. Jake pushed open the heavy wooden door, and it groaned like something awakening from a long sleep. A shaft of morning sunlight cut through the darkness, illuminating dancing dust motes that scattered like startled spirits. The smell hit him first, not the musty decay he'd expected, but something else entirely. Cedar and pine, yes, but underneath lay traces of tobacco from his grandfather's old pipe and something metallic, almost electrical. Jake stepped inside, his sneakers silent on the thick layer of dust covering worn wooden planks. The cabin was smaller than he'd imagined from his mother's stories, but somehow it felt larger than its physical dimensions suggested. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney disappearing into shadows above. Rough-hewn beams stretched across the ceiling like the ribs of some ancient beast. Everything was covered in white sheets, creating ghostly furniture shapes in the dim light. Jake pulled out his phone's flashlight and swept it across the room. The beam caught something unusual. The walls themselves seemed to be constructed differently than any building he'd ever seen. The logs weren't simply stacked. They were fitted together with intricate joints and connections that created patterns almost too complex to follow. It was as if the entire structure had been assembled like a massive wooden puzzle. He moved toward what appeared to be a desk near the back wall and pulled away the sheet. Dust billowed up, making him cough, but beneath lay a beautiful hand-carved writing desk, its surface unmarked by time. A leather-bound journal sat in the center, as if his grandfather had just stepped away for a moment. Jake opened the journal with trembling fingers. The first page bore his grandfather's familiar handwriting. For Jake, when you were ready to understand what we really build, when we build with intention. Below that, a date from just 3 months before his grandfather's death, and a single line that made Jake's skin prickle. They're getting closer to the truth. The blueprint must be protected. He flipped through pages filled with sketches, measurements, and notes, written in a mixture of English and what looked like symbols he didn't recognize. Some drawings showed the cabin itself, but others depicted structures that seemed impossible, buildings that appeared to fold in on themselves, rooms that existed in spaces that shouldn't fit within their outer walls. A loose photograph fell from between the pages, landing face up on the dusty floor. Jake bent to retrieve it and found himself staring at a picture of his grandfather standing beside a much younger man outside this very cabin. But in the photo, the building looked different, larger somehow, with additional sections that Jake was certain weren't there now. The sound of a car engine growing closer made him freeze. He wasn't expecting anyone, and the road to the cabin was private property. Jake quickly pocketed the journal and moved to the window, peering through a gap in the boards his grandfather had nailed over the glass. A black SUV with tinted windows was making its way up the winding dirt road, moving slowly but deliberately. Jake's pulse quickened. The vehicle looked expensive and out of place in these remote mountains. It definitely wasn't a park ranger or local sheriff's deputy. The SUV stopped about 50 yards from the cabin, and 2 figures emerged. Even from this distance, Jake could tell they weren't hikers or tourists. They wore dark clothing and moved with the purposeful efficiency of people accustomed to finding what they were looking for, whether or not they were welcome. Jake's mind raced. He thought about his mother's warnings, her insistence that he stay away from the cabin. Had she known something like this might happen? The journal in his pocket seemed to grow heavier as he watched the figures approach the cabin, one of them speaking into what looked like a radio or phone. Moving as quietly as possible, Jake made his way to the back of the cabin. He remembered his grandfather once telling him about a root cellar, accessible from both inside and outside the building. If he could find it, he might be able to slip away without being seen. The floorboards near the back wall were loose, and when Jake pried one up, he discovered a narrow wooden ladder descending into darkness. The construction down here was even more unusual than above. The underground space seemed to extend much further than the cabin's footprint should have allowed. Above him, he heard the front door creak open and heavy footsteps on the wooden floor. A voice, muffled but clearly agitated, called out, "The place has been disturbed. Someone's been here recently." Another voice responded, but Jake couldn't make out the words. He descended into the root cellar, clutching the journal and hoping the darkness would hide him until these unwelcome visitors decided to leave. But as his feet touched the earthen floor below, Jake realized he'd stumbled into something far more complex than a simple inheritance. The journal in his pocket and the mysterious construction around him were apparently worth killing for, and someone knew he was here. The morning light filtered through the cabin's grimy windows as Jake spread the blueprint across the dusty kitchen table. His grandfather's journal lay open beside it, filled with cramped handwriting that seemed to dance before his tired eyes. He'd barely slept, his mind churning over the strange discovery hidden beneath the floorboards. The blueprint showed the cabin's structure, but not as Jake knew it. According to the drawing, there should be a basement, a substantial one with multiple chambers branching off like the roots of an ancient tree. Yet when he'd explored yesterday, he'd found only solid ground beneath the main floor. Jake traced his finger along the blueprint's intricate lines. The construction technique depicted was unlike anything he'd seen in shop class. Instead of standard framing, the design showed interlocking wooden joints that seemed to spiral and weave together, creating a framework that appeared almost organic. Strange symbols marked various connection points, symbols that matched those scattered throughout his grandfather's journal. "The old ways hold strength. The new world has forgotten," Jake read aloud from one of the journal entries. "What modern builders accomplish with steel and concrete, our ancestors achieved with understanding. The mountain teaches patience. The trees offer their secrets to those who listen." A knock at the front door made Jake jump. He quickly rolled up the blueprint and shoved the journal into his backpack before answering. A woman in her 50s stood on the porch, her sharp grey suit completely out of place against the wilderness backdrop. "Jacob Morrison?" she asked, extending a manicured hand. "I'm Victoria Crane from Crane Development Group. I understand you've inherited this property." Jake nodded cautiously. "Yeah, that's right. I'd like to make you an offer." Victoria's smile seemed practiced, professional. "This land has significant development potential. My company specializes in mountain resort communities, and this location would be perfect for luxury cabins. I'm not interested in selling." Victoria's smile faltered slightly. "Perhaps you should hear my offer first. I'm prepared to pay well above market value, $200,000 for the land and structure." The number hit Jake like a physical blow. $200,000 would cover his college tuition and then some. It would solve every financial worry his family faced. But something about Victoria Crane made his skin crawl. "I said I'm not interested. Mr. Morrison, I don't think you understand the challenges of maintaining property this remote. The costs alone." "The answer is no." Jake stepped back and began closing the door. Victoria's hand shot out, stopping the door's movement. For just a moment, her pleasant facade cracked, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "This offer won't remain open indefinitely. Mountain properties can be dangerous. Accidents happen." Jake yanked the door shut and threw the deadbolt. Through the window, he watched Victoria walk back to a black SUV parked on the access road. She made a phone call before driving away, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made a very dangerous enemy. Alone again, Jake unrolled the blueprint and returned to his grandfather's journal. He flipped through pages of notes about wood grain patterns, moon phases, and something called resonance points. One entry, dated just 3 months before his grandfather's death, caught his attention. They're getting closer. Found tire tracks near the eastern boundary again, and someone's been asking questions in town. The secret must be protected. Jake is almost old enough to understand. The cabin will teach him if I'm not here to do it myself. A chill ran down Jake's spine. His grandfather had known someone was watching, searching for something, and somehow Jake was meant to continue whatever work his grandfather had been doing. He studied the blueprint more carefully, focusing on the basement chambers. If they existed, there had to be an entrance somewhere. Jake spent the next hour examining every inch of the cabin's interior, tapping floorboards and checking for hidden panels. In the bedroom behind his grandfather's old dresser, he found something interesting, a section of wall that sounded hollow when tapped. The dresser was heavier than it looked, but Jake managed to push it aside. Behind it, barely visible in the dim light, was an outline in the wood paneling. When Jake pressed against it, a section of the wall swung inward on silent hinges. Cool air flowed up from the darkness beyond, carrying the scent of earth and something else, something that reminded Jake of the workshop where his grandfather had taught him to work with wood. Jake grabbed a flashlight from his backpack and stepped through the hidden doorway. A narrow staircase descended into the mountain itself. The walls were lined with the same intricate wooden framework shown in the blueprint, joints interlocking in patterns that seemed to pulse and flow in the flashlight's beam. Each step downward felt like a journey back through time. At the bottom, Jake found himself in a workshop that took his breath away. Hand tools hung from the walls, some familiar, others completely alien in design. Partially completed wooden structures filled the space, their purpose unclear but their craftsmanship undeniable. And scattered across every surface were more blueprints, dozens of them, showing structures that defied everything Jake thought he knew about construction. The morning light filtering through the cracked windows revealed details Jake had missed in yesterday's dim exploration. Dust motes danced in golden shafts as he carefully spread the blueprint across the warped kitchen table, weighing down the corners with smooth river stones he'd found outside. The ancient paper crackled with each movement, threatening to tear along its well-worn creases. The construction technique depicted was unlike anything he'd studied in shop class. Instead of conventional nails or screws, the blueprint showed an intricate system of interlocking wooden joints, dovetails that curved impossibly, mortise and tenon connections that seemed to defy physics. Strange symbols marked specific measurements, their meanings lost to time. Jake traced his finger along the cabin's foundation diagram, comparing it to the actual structure around him. According to the blueprint, there should be additional rooms beneath the floorboards. His pulse quickened as he realized the cabin was only the visible portion of something much larger. Grandfather's journal lay open beside the blueprint, its leather cover worn smooth by countless readings. Jake flipped through pages of cramped handwriting, searching for clues about the construction method. Most entries were mundane, weather observations, supply lists, maintenance notes, but occasionally cryptic phrases appeared in the margins. The old ways remember what we have forgotten. Wood speaks to those who listen. They watch from the valley. Trust no one who asks too many questions. That last entry made Jake's skin crawl. He glanced toward the windows, suddenly aware of how exposed he was up here. The valley stretched below, a patchwork of forests and meadows that looked peaceful enough, but his grandfather's paranoia suggested otherwise. A loose floorboard creaked under his feet as he moved to examine the eastern wall. He knelt and pried at the edge with his pocket knife until the board lifted. Beneath it, instead of empty space, he found a wooden panel covered in the same strange symbols from the blueprint. The wood was different here, darker, older, carved with precision that spoke of master craftsmanship. Jake worked systematically, lifting adjacent boards until he'd exposed a 3-foot section of the hidden panel. The symbols formed a pattern that matched a corner detail on the blueprint. He pressed against various carved elements, hoping to trigger some kind of mechanism. Nothing happened. Frustrated, he consulted the journal again, this time paying closer attention to his grandfather's sketches scattered between written entries. One drawing showed hands positioned over similar symbols, fingers aligned in a specific sequence. Jake mimicked the hand positions, pressing the symbols in the indicated order. The panel shifted with a soft click. A section slid away, revealing a cavity containing rolled papers tied with faded ribbon. Jake's hands trembled as he carefully extracted the documents. The first was another blueprint, more detailed than the one on the table. This one showed the complete underground structure, a network of rooms and tunnels extending deep into the mountain itself. The second document made his blood run cold. It was a letter addressed to him, written in his grandfather's hand, but dated only 3 months ago. "Jake, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've found the first blueprint. I hoped it would never come to this, but the family secret must not die with me. What you've discovered is only the beginning. Our ancestors brought something precious from the old country, knowledge that others would kill to possess. The construction technique isn't just about building, it's about hiding, about protecting something that must never fall into the wrong hands. Every joint, every symbol serves a purpose beyond mere carpentry. The cabin is a lock, and you now hold the key. But know this, you are not safe here. They've been watching for generations, waiting for someone to inherit the secret. Trust no one from the valley. The Hendersons claim to be friends, but their family has hunted ours for over a century. They know something lies hidden in these mountains. Complete the restoration. Follow the blueprints exactly. Every symbol must be perfect, every joint precise. Only then will you understand what your great-great-grandfather died protecting. The answers lie deeper than you can imagine. Stay alert. They will come. Grandfather. Jake's mouth went dry. He thought about yesterday's encounter with Tom Henderson, the man's casual questions about the cabin's condition, his offer of help. Had that been genuine neighborliness, or something more sinister? A sound outside made him freeze, the distant rumble of an engine climbing the mountain road. Jake quickly gathered the documents, his movements sharp with sudden urgency. He replaced the floorboards as best he could, then moved to the window. A black pickup truck was winding up the narrow track toward the cabin. Through the windshield, he could make out 2 figures, though the distance made identification impossible. The vehicle moved with purpose, not the casual pace of someone out for a scenic drive. Jake grabbed his backpack and stuffed the blueprints and journal inside. Whatever his grandfather had hidden here, whoever was coming up that mountain road, he knew with crystalline certainty that his quiet summer of restoration work had just become something far more dangerous. The engine sound grew louder, and Jake made his decision. He needed answers before he faced whoever was in that truck, and those answers lay somewhere in the hidden chambers beneath his feet. The morning sun filtered through the pine trees as Jake spread the blueprint across the cabin's weathered porch. Every line and symbol seemed to pulse with hidden meaning, but the construction method remained frustratingly elusive. He traced the intricate patterns with his finger, noting how certain sections appeared to interlock in ways that defied conventional building techniques. A rustling in the underbrush made him look up sharply. Through the trees, he caught a glimpse of movement, someone watching from the ridge above. The figure disappeared before he could make out any details, but the feeling of being observed sent a chill down his spine. Jake quickly rolled up the blueprint and headed inside, his grandfather's journal tucked under his arm. The cabin's interior felt different in daylight, less oppressive but somehow more mysterious. Dust motes danced in the golden light streaming through cracked windows, and every creaking floorboard seemed to whisper secrets. He settled at the old wooden table and opened the journal to where he'd left off. His grandfather's handwriting grew more erratic on the next page, as if written in haste. Old ways are not forgotten by all. There are those who remember what the mountains hold, what power sleeps beneath stone and timber. They will come for the knowledge. Trust no one who asks too many questions about the cabin. The blueprint must never fall into the wrong hands. Jake's heart hammered as he read on. His grandfather described visitors in the final months before his death, Strangers asking about the property, offering substantial sums to purchase it, becoming increasingly insistent when refused. One entry made Jake's blood run cold. Broke in again last night. Found nothing, but they're getting bolder. I've hidden the blueprint well, but I fear they know it exists. If something happens to me, Jacob must be warned. The construction method isn't just about building, it's about protecting. The ancients knew secrets that some would kill for. A vehicle's engine cut through the mountain silence, growing louder as it approached the cabin. Jake peered through the window and saw a black SUV with tinted windows pulling up the gravel drive. Two men in expensive suits climbed out, looking distinctly out of place in the wilderness setting. Jake quickly hid the journal and blueprint in the cabin's old root cellar, accessible through a trapdoor in the kitchen floor. He'd barely smoothed the rug back into place when heavy footsteps echoed on the porch. The knock was authoritative, demanding. Jake opened the door to find two men studying him with calculating eyes. The older one, silver-haired and wearing a smile that didn't reach his eyes, extended his hand. "Mr. Morrison, I'm David Sterling from Mountain Heritage Development. This is my associate, Mr. Chen. We understand you've inherited this property." Jake shook the offered hand reluctantly, noting the man's grip was unnecessarily firm. "That's right. Can I help you?" "We represent investors interested in preserving historical mountain properties. Your grandfather's cabin has significant cultural value. We'd like to make you a very generous offer." "It's not for sale," Jake said immediately. Sterling's smile faltered for just a moment. "Perhaps you should hear our offer first. We're prepared to pay well above market value, enough to set a young man like yourself up for life." "I said it's not for sale." Jake started to close the door, but Chen stepped forward, his bulk blocking the frame. "Your grandfather was a stubborn man too," Sterling said, his tone cooling. "It didn't serve him well in the end." The implied threat hung in the air like smoke. Jake felt anger flare in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I think you should leave." "Of course. But Jake, may I call you Jake? Sometimes holding on to the past can be dangerous. Old buildings like this, isolated as they are, accidents happen, fires, structural collapses." Sterling's eyes swept over the cabin's weathered exterior. It would be tragic if something happened to such a historically significant structure. Chen reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, placing it deliberately on the porch railing. "Call us when you reconsider. And Jake, be careful who you trust. Your grandfather learned too late that some secrets are better left buried." The two men returned to their SUV and drove away, leaving Jake standing on the porch with his heart racing. The business card felt heavy in his hand as he read the embossed lettering, "Mountain Heritage Development, preserving the past, securing the future." As the sound of their engine faded, Jake noticed something that made his stomach drop. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt near the cabin's foundation, different from the SUV's tread pattern. Someone else had been here recently, probably while he was in town yesterday. He circled the cabin, finding evidence of tampering near the foundation stones. Someone had been probing, searching for something hidden beneath the structure itself. The realization hit him like a physical blow. They weren't just after the blueprint. They were looking for whatever the ancient construction method was designed to protect. Jake stared up at the mountains surrounding the cabin, feeling suddenly very alone and very young. But alongside the fear, something else stirred, determination. His grandfather had trusted him with this legacy, and Jake wasn't about to let intimidation tactics scare him away from uncovering the truth. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin's weathered deck as Jake spread the blueprint across the rough-hewn table he'd dragged outside. Sarah knelt beside him, her finger tracing the intricate lines that seemed to pulse with ancient knowledge. The paper felt warm beneath their touch, as if the very ink held some residual energy from its creation. "Look at these measurements," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the mountain breeze. "They're not in feet or inches. It's like your grandfather was using some completely different system." Jake squinted at the strange symbols scattered throughout the margins. His grandfather's handwriting was cramped and urgent, notes scrawled in what appeared to be multiple languages. Some looked familiar, Spanish maybe, or Italian, but others were completely foreign, angular marks that seemed to dance before his eyes. "There," he said suddenly, pointing to a corner where the paper had been folded so many times it was nearly translucent. "That's the foundation technique he mentioned in the journal." The diagram showed a complex web of interlocking stones, but not arranged in any pattern Jake had ever seen in construction books. Instead of the typical rectangular grid, these stones formed spirals and curves, creating what looked almost like a living root system beneath the cabin's frame. Numbers and arrows indicated precise angles, specific depths, particular orientations that seemed tied to celestial movements. Sarah pulled out her phone and began photographing the sections, but as soon as the camera flash activated, the ink on the blueprint began to fade. Within seconds, entire portions of the diagram had vanished completely. "What the hell?" Jake grabbed the paper, holding it up to the light. The missing sections were completely blank, as if they'd never contained any markings at all. "It's reacting to the camera," Sarah said, her face pale. "Try covering it and uncovering it slowly." Jake draped his shirt over a corner of the blueprint, then gradually pulled it back. The ink slowly reappeared, seeping back into the paper like water soaking into dry earth. But now the diagrams looked different. Some lines had shifted, new notations had appeared in the margins, and what had been a simple foundation layout now revealed additional layers of complexity. "This is impossible," he muttered. But even as he said it, he remembered his grandfather's journal entry about the living design that would reveal itself to those who earned its trust. A twig snapped in the forest behind them. Both teenagers turned, scanning the tree line for movement. The woods were still, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He'd felt it since yesterday, a persistent itch between his shoulder blades that suggested unfriendly eyes tracking his every move. "We should go inside," Sarah said, rolling up the blueprint carefully. "This feels too exposed." Jake nodded, gathering his grandfather's journals and tools. As they headed toward the cabin door, he caught a glimpse of reflected light from the hillside opposite. The brief, sharp glint of glass or metal, binoculars maybe, or a rifle scope. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere felt charged with possibility and danger. Jake cleared a space on the floor and laid out the blueprint again, this time by lamplight rather than sunshine. The ink responded differently to the artificial illumination, revealing yet another layer of detail. "Your grandfather wasn't just an eccentric old man," Sarah said, studying the emerging patterns. "He was protecting something. This technique, these measurements, they're not just for building a cabin, they're for something much more important." Jake opened the journal to a page he'd bookmarked earlier. His grandfather's handwriting was shaky here, as if written in great haste or under extreme stress. The foundation must be completed before the autumn equinox. If the alignment is broken, if the stones are disturbed, the barrier will fail. They will find what was hidden. They will finish what was started 70 years ago. Barrier? Sarah looked up from the blueprint. What kind of barrier? Before Jake could respond, the sound of an engine echoed through the valley below. A black SUV was winding its way up the mountain road, moving faster than was safe on the narrow, unpaved track. Through the cabin's front window, Jake could see it was the same vehicle that had been parked at the gas station yesterday when he'd stopped for supplies. "They found us," he said, his mouth suddenly dry. Sarah was already moving, rolling up the blueprint and stuffing it into her backpack along with the most important journals. "Is there another way out of here?" Jake's mind raced, remembering childhood summers spent exploring every inch of these mountains with his grandfather. "There's a trail behind the cabin. It leads to an old mining road about 2 miles north." The engine noise grew louder, closer. Through the trees, Jake could see dust clouds marking the SUV's rapid approach. Whoever was driving wasn't being subtle anymore. The time for surveillance had passed. "Grab everything important," Jake said, shouldering his own pack. "We're about to find out just how badly someone wants my grandfather's secrets." The beam creaked ominously as Jake positioned the final corner joint, his hands trembling slightly as he followed the precise measurements from the blueprint. 3 days had passed since he'd started implementing his grandfather's ancient technique, and the cabin was transforming in ways that defied everything he'd learned about construction. The wood seemed to respond to his touch, fitting together with an almost magnetic precision that made his skin prickle. "This can't be right," he muttered, stepping back to examine his work. The new support beam appeared to be floating, connected to the existing structure by joints so seamless they were nearly invisible. Yet when he pressed against it, the entire wall felt solid as granite. A shadow moved past the window, and Jake's heart lurched. He grabbed his grandfather's journal from the makeshift workbench and crouched behind a stack of lumber. The footsteps outside were deliberate, circling the cabin with predatory patience. This was the 3rd time in 2 days that someone had come prowling around, always when the sun began its descent behind the pine trees. The front door rattled as someone tested the lock. Jake held his breath, grateful he'd had the foresight to barricade it from the inside. The footsteps moved to the window where he'd been working, and he caught a glimpse of a figure in dark clothing peering through the glass. The intruder's face was obscured by a hood, but something about the way they moved suggested familiarity with the cabin's layout. After what felt like an eternity, the presence withdrew. Jake waited another 10 minutes before emerging from his hiding spot, his pulse gradually returning to normal. He needed to work faster. Whatever his grandfather had been protecting, people were growing impatient to claim it. Opening the journal to a page he'd bookmarked, Jake studied the cryptic notes once more. "The foundation speaks to those who listen," his grandfather had written in his careful script. 7 points of connection, 7 seals of protection. Complete the circle before the new moon, or the mountain will reclaim what was borrowed. Jake glanced at the calendar he'd tacked to the wall. 4 days until the new moon. He'd completed 3 of the 7 connection points, but each one grew more complex, requiring materials that seemed impossible to find. Yesterday, he'd needed a specific type of iron that had to be blessed by mountain water and tempered by honest sweat. He'd spent hours hiking to the stream his grandfather had shown him years ago, carrying the metal components in his backpack like some kind of medieval blacksmith. The strangest part was that it had worked. The iron had changed color when he'd submerged it in the mountain stream, taking on a deep blue-black hue that hadn't existed in any metallurgy textbook he'd ever seen. When he'd heated it with the portable torch he'd brought from town, the metal had shaped itself under his hammer as if it wanted to become part of the cabin's frame. A knock at the door froze him mid-thought. This was different from the earlier prowling. 3 sharp raps that echoed through the cabin with authority. "Jake Morrison? This is Sheriff Hawkins. I need to speak with you." Jake approached the door cautiously. He recognized the sheriff's voice from the few times their paths had crossed in town, but trust was becoming a luxury he couldn't afford. "What about, Sheriff?" "There've been some reports of suspicious activity up here. Folks in town are concerned about lights and sounds coming from the old Fletcher place at odd hours." The old Fletcher place. That was what the locals called his grandfather's cabin, even though Grandpa Pete had owned it for over 30 years. Jake cracked open the door, keeping the chain latch engaged. Sheriff Hawkins stood on the porch alone, his weathered face creased with what looked like genuine concern. "Just restoring the place, Sheriff. My grandfather left it to me. I know about the inheritance, son. But there are other folks who've taken an interest in this property, some with questionable intentions." The sheriff's eyes darted to the windows, scanning for potential threats. "Your grandfather made some enemies before he passed. People who believed he'd found something valuable up here." "Like what?" Sheriff Hawkins was quiet for a long moment. "Pete never told you about the gold surveys from the 1800s? This whole mountainside was mapped by prospectors, but they never found what they were looking for. Some folks think Pete discovered what those old miners missed. Gold. That would explain the prowlers, but it didn't explain the impossible construction techniques, or the way the cabin seemed to pulse with energy when Jake worked on it." His grandfather's secrets ran deeper than precious metals. "I appreciate the warning, Sheriff, but I'm just fixing up the place. Nothing valuable here except memories." The sheriff nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "Watch yourself, Jake. Lock your doors, and if you see anything unusual, you call me immediately." He handed over a business card with his direct number. "And son, maybe consider working during daylight hours only. The mountain gets dangerous after dark." The morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin's foundation as Jake knelt beside the ancient stone markers his grandfather had left behind. Each weathered granite post bore symbols that matched those in the journal: spirals, interlocking circles, and geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with meaning just beyond his comprehension. Sarah crouched beside him, her camera clicking softly as she documented each marking. "These aren't random," she murmured, adjusting her lens. "Look at how they're positioned relative to the cardinal directions." Jake traced one of the spirals with his finger, feeling the rough texture of stone worn smooth by decades of mountain weather. The blueprint spread between them showed corresponding marks, but seeing the actual stones in place made something click in his mind. "They're not just markers," he said suddenly. "They're part of the foundation itself." The realization sent a chill down his spine. According to the journal, his great-great-grandfather had discovered something in these mountains, something that had driven him to develop this unique construction method. The traditional logs and mortar were just the visible layer. Beneath lay a more ancient technique, one that worked with the natural forces of the mountain rather than against them. Jake pulled out his grandfather's surveying equipment, a battered transit that had seen decades of use. As he set it up over the central stone, memories of childhood visits flooded back, watching the old man take precise measurements, muttering about angles and alignments that young Jake had dismissed as perfectionist obsession. "Bearing north-northeast, 23 degrees, he called out, reading the instrument's compass. Sarah moved to the corresponding position, placing a wooden stake where the sightline intersected with the foundation's edge. They worked methodically, following the journal's detailed instructions. Each measurement revealed new relationships between the stones, creating a geometric pattern that extended far beyond the cabin's footprint. The design incorporated natural features of the mountainside: an ancient oak tree, a granite outcropping, even the seasonal flow of an underground spring that emerged 50 yards downhill. "Jake!" Sarah's voice carried an edge of excitement. "Come look at this." She stood near the cabin's northeast corner, where one of the larger foundation stones had shifted slightly over the years. The gap revealed a hollow space beneath, and when Jake knelt beside her, he could feel cool air flowing from the opening. "There's something down there," she whispered. Jake retrieved a flashlight from his toolkit and aimed the beam into the gap. The light revealed worked stone, not the rough field stone of the foundation, but carefully fitted blocks that formed what appeared to be a chamber. Symbols covered the visible walls, more elaborate versions of those marked on the surface stones. "We need to move this stone," Jake said, though even as he spoke, he felt a creeping unease. His grandfather's journal had mentioned dangers, warnings about disturbing certain elements before the proper time. Sarah was already examining the shifted stone, running her hands along its edges. "It's not just loose," she said. "Look at these grooves. It's designed to slide." Together they worked the stone carefully to one side. The opening revealed a narrow shaft descending into the mountain. Stone steps spiraled down into darkness, and the symbols on the walls seemed to dance in their flashlight beam. "This is why someone tried to burn the cabin," Jake said, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "It wasn't about stopping the reconstruction, it was about hiding this." Sarah shouldered her camera bag. "We're going down there, aren't we?" Jake consulted the journal one more time. His grandfather's final entries spoke of a choice point, a moment when the old knowledge would either be lost forever or pass to a new generation. The timing wasn't random. It was connected to the mountain itself, to seasonal alignments and natural forces that his ancestors had learned to read. "According to this, we have until the autumn equinox," he said. 3 weeks. If the cabin isn't properly restored by then, something called the binding fails permanently. What's the binding? Jake studied the cryptic passages, translating his grandfather's careful script. Some kind of containment. My great-great-grandfather wasn't just building a cabin, he was maintaining something that was already here, something that needed to be kept stable. The implications sent ice through his veins, the attempts to drive them away, the mysterious figure watching from the trees, even the precision of the arson attempt. Someone else knew about this place and its secrets. Someone who perhaps believed those secrets should remain buried. Sarah was already starting down the stone steps, her flashlight beam revealing more chambers below. "Whatever it is," she called back, "we're not going to figure it out standing here." Jake glanced once more at the peaceful morning forest around them, knowing that by the time they emerged, everything would be different. Then he shouldered his pack and followed Sarah into the mountain's hidden depths, leaving the innocent world of blueprints and construction far behind. The shadows stretched long across the valley floor as Jake made his way down the treacherous mountain path, his grandfather's journal clutched tightly against his chest. Every snap of a twig behind him sent his heart racing, and he found himself glancing over his shoulder with increasing frequency. The encounter with the black-clad figure at the cabin had shaken him more than he cared to admit. His phone buzzed as he reached the main road. Sarah's name flashed on the screen. "Jake, where are you? I've been trying to call for hours." "I'm coming down from the cabin." "Sarah, something's wrong. Really wrong." He quickened his pace toward his truck, keys already in hand. "What happened? You sound terrified." Jake slammed the truck door and locked it immediately. Someone was watching me. Someone who knew about the blueprint. "They threatened me, Sarah. Said I should forget about the cabin and everything in it." A long pause. "Jake, maybe they're right. Maybe you should just walk away from this whole thing." "I can't." He started the engine and pulled onto the winding mountain road. "Not after what I found in Grandpa's journal today. Sarah, I think my grandfather discovered something incredible up there, something worth killing for. Then we need to call the police." "And tell them what? That someone in black clothes told me to stop renovating a cabin I own?" "They'd laugh us out of the station." Jake navigated a sharp curve, his headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. "Besides, I think the police might already be compromised." "What do you mean?" Jake's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he remembered Deputy Harrison's odd questions and suspicious timing at the cabin the week before. "I'll explain when I see you. Can you meet me at the diner in town?" "I'm already here." "Been waiting for you to call back." 20 minutes later, Jake slid into the worn vinyl booth across from Sarah, the journal between them like a bridge spanning troubled waters. The diner was nearly empty, just a few locals nursing coffee at the counter and the perpetual hum of fluorescent lights overhead. "Show me," Sarah said simply. Jake opened the journal to the pages he'd discovered that afternoon. Sarah's eyes widened as she took in the detailed sketches and notes written in his grandfather's careful handwriting. "These aren't just construction techniques," she whispered. "These are architectural blueprints for something massive. Look at these dimensions, Jake. This isn't about your cabin at all." She was right. The pages revealed plans for an elaborate underground structure, complete with ventilation systems, multiple chambers, and what appeared to be sophisticated engineering far beyond anything a simple mountain cabin would require. "Read this entry," Jake said, pointing to a passage dated 3 months before his grandfather's death. He talks about the discovery that changes everything, and mentions meeting with someone called the Surveyor. But then look here. He flipped ahead several pages. The handwriting becomes rushed, almost frantic. He keeps mentioning being watched, being followed. Sarah leaned closer, her voice barely audible. "Jake, this last entry. It's dated the day before your grandfather died." Jake nodded grimly. He'd memorized the words already. "They know I know. The construction was never about building something new. It was about hiding something old, something that's been here far longer than any of us realized. If something happens to me, I pray Jake will understand what I've started. The truth is buried beneath the cabin, but the foundation must be completed first. The ancient method is the key. Without it, the ground itself will claim anyone who tries to excavate. God forgive me for what I've uncovered. Jake. Sarah's voice was tight with worry. What if your grandfather didn't die of natural causes? What if he was murdered? The thought had been gnawing at Jake since that afternoon, but hearing Sarah voice it made it real in a way that terrified him. The doctor said it was a heart attack, but Grandpa was in good health. He hiked these mountains every day, unless the stress of being threatened gave him a heart attack. Jake closed the journal and looked around the diner nervously. I think someone's been systematically covering up whatever Grandpa found. But why leave me the cabin? Why risk me discovering the truth? Maybe they didn't have a choice. Maybe your grandfather hid the evidence too well for them to find it without the journal. Which means they need me to lead them to it. The realization hit Jake like a physical blow. I'm not the target, Sarah. I'm the bait. Outside the diner windows, a black sedan with tinted windows pulled slowly into the parking lot, its engine idling as it faced the building. Neither Jake nor Sarah noticed it immediately, too absorbed in the journal's revelations. But when Sarah finally glanced up and saw the car, her face went pale. Jake, she whispered urgently, don't turn around. But I think we need to leave, right now. The morning mist clung to the mountainside like ghostly fingers as Jake crept through the underbrush. His grandfather's journal clutched against his chest. Every shadow seemed to harbor watchers, every rustling branch a potential threat. The events of the previous night had shattered any illusion of safety. Someone had been inside the cabin, searching, and they'd left behind more than just ransacked furniture. Blood, fresh drops on the wooden floor that hadn't been there when he'd fled to Sarah's house. Now, crouched behind a fallen pine log 50 yards from the cabin, Jake studied the structure that had consumed his thoughts for weeks. In the pale dawn light, it looked different somehow. The walls he'd been working to restore seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly quality, as if the ancient building technique was awakening something that had slumbered for decades. His phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. Police found nothing. They think you're paranoid. Be careful. Jake's jaw tightened. Of course the intruders had cleaned up after themselves. These weren't common thieves looking for valuables. They were professionals hunting for something specific, something connected to the blueprint he'd discovered hidden in the cabin's walls. A twig snapped behind him. Jake spun around, his heart hammering, but saw only empty forest. The silence that followed felt oppressive, unnatural. Even the birds had stopped singing. Moving carefully, he approached the cabin from the rear, staying low and keeping to the tree line, the back wall where he'd made the most progress with his grandfather's mysterious construction method drew his attention immediately. The logs fitted together with impossible precision, their surfaces bearing symbols he was only beginning to understand. According to the journal, this technique was more than just building. It was preservation, protection, containment. But containing what? The kitchen window had been left open. Jake was certain he'd closed it before fleeing last night. He circled to the front porch, noting disturbed earth near the foundation stones. Someone had been digging. The front door stood slightly ajar. Jake hesitated, every instinct screaming danger, but buried somewhere in those walls were answers about his grandfather's death, about the people who wanted him dead, about the ancient knowledge that someone would kill to suppress. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cabin's interior had been systematically torn apart. Floorboards pried up, walls probed for hidden compartments, even the stone fireplace partially dismantled, but they'd been careful, methodical. This wasn't vandalism, it was archaeology performed with surgical precision. Jake pulled out his grandfather's journal, flipping to the entry that had haunted him since yesterday. Old ways demand balance. What we build up, we must also hold down. The foundation stones aren't just for support, they're anchors. If someone disturbs the pattern, if they break the containment without understanding. The entry ended abruptly, But Jake was beginning to piece together the implications. His grandfather hadn't just built a cabin, he'd constructed some kind of prison. And Jake's restoration work, guided by the ancient blueprint, was either reinforcing those bindings or, terrifyingly, weakening them. A floorboard creaked overhead. Jake froze, blood turning to ice. The cabin was single-story. There was no upstairs. Another creak, deliberate and measured, as if someone was walking across a floor that shouldn't exist. Jake's eyes traveled to the ceiling, following the sound. The footsteps moved from the kitchen area toward the main room, staying precisely above his head. But that was impossible. He'd been in the attic space while installing insulation. It was barely 3 feet high, filled with cobwebs and old lumber. The footsteps stopped directly overhead. Then, with a groan of stressed wood, the ceiling began to sag. Jake dove sideways as a section of planks crashed down, bringing with them a shower of dust, debris, and something else, fragments of what looked like carved stone, covered in the same symbols he'd seen throughout his grandfather's journal. Through the hole in the ceiling, Jake glimpsed movement in the shadows above. Not human movement, something that flowed like liquid darkness, constrained by barriers that were clearly weakening. His grandfather's final journal entry suddenly made terrible sense. And I've kept it contained for 40 years, but I'm dying, and the bindings won't hold without someone to maintain them. If Jake inherits the cabin, if he finds the blueprint, he must understand. He's not just restoring a building, he's reinforcing a cage. The temperature in the cabin plummeted. Jake's breath misted as he grabbed the journal and backed toward the door. Whatever his grandfather had imprisoned up there was stirring, responding to the disturbance of the restoration work. And Jake realized with growing horror that by following the ancient building technique, by strengthening some walls and foundations, he'd inadvertently weakened others. The containment was failing. Behind him, the front door slammed shut with supernatural force. The windows followed suit, their frames warping and sealing as if the cabin itself was determined to keep him inside. In the growing darkness, something began to descend through the hole in the ceiling. The morning mist clung to the mountainside like ghostly fingers as Jake crept through the dense undergrowth, his grandfather's journal pressed against his chest. The events of the previous night had shattered any illusion of safety. Finding Marcus's truck abandoned at the base of the mountain, the engine still warm, had confirmed his worst fears. They were closer than ever. Sarah moved silently beside him, her face pale but determined. They had agreed to split up from Tommy, who was taking the main trail back to town to get help from Sheriff Morrison. Jake only hoped the sheriff would believe their story about the construction company's real intentions. "There," Sarah whispered, pointing through a gap in the trees. "I can see the cabin." Jake's heart sank. Even from this distance, he could see the damage. The front porch his grandfather had built decades ago was partially collapsed, and fresh tire tracks carved deep ruts in the clearing. But what made his blood run cold was the sight of 3 black SUVs parked in a semicircle around the property. "We're too late," he breathed. "No, look." Sarah grabbed his arm. "The main support beam is still intact, the one you've been working on with your grandfather's technique. They haven't figured out how to remove it." She was right. The massive central beam, reinforced using the ancient method from the blueprint, stood defiant amid the destruction. Jake could see figures in dark clothing moving around it, examining the joints and connections with obvious frustration. They can't take it down without understanding how it was built, Jake realized. Grandpa designed it that way. A new voice cut through the morning air, cold and authoritative. "Bring me the boy's phone records. If he's made contact with anyone about this property, I want to know." Jake recognized the voice immediately. Elena Voss, the woman who had posed as a representative from Pinnacle Development. But now, seeing her direct a team of armed men, her true nature was unmistakable. "Sir," one of the men called out, "we've found something else. There's a tunnel entrance near the back foundation." Jake's stomach dropped. The tunnel. In all the chaos, he had forgotten about the hidden passage he'd discovered beneath the cabin. the one that led deep into the mountain and connected to a network of caves his grandfather had mentioned in his journal. "Whatever's down there," Sarah whispered, "it's what they're really after." The cabin technique was just part of something bigger. As if responding to her words, Elena's voice rang out again. "Begin excavation immediately and deploy the scanning equipment. According to our geological surveys, the main chamber should be directly beneath the cabin's foundation." Jake's mind raced through fragments from his grandfather's journal, cryptic references to the guardian structure and protecting what lies beneath. The cabin wasn't just built using an ancient technique, it was constructed to hide something that Elena Voss and her organization desperately wanted. "We have to get down there first," Jake said, his voice barely audible. "Are you insane? Look how many of them there are." "There's another entrance. Grandpa wrote about it in his journal, an old mining shaft about half a mile east of here. It connects to the same cave system." Sarah stared at him. "And you think whatever's down there is worth risking our lives for?" Before Jake could answer, the sound of engines starting filled the air. Two of the SUVs were pulling away, heading down the mountain road. Elena was reducing her visible presence, probably expecting the local authorities to investigate the disturbance eventually. "Now's our chance," Jake said. "With fewer people here, we might actually make it to the mining shaft." They began working their way around the perimeter of the property, staying well within the tree line. Jake's heart hammered as they passed close enough to hear the excavation team discussing their equipment. They were professional, efficient, and absolutely ruthless in their systematic destruction of everything his grandfather had built. The old mining shaft was exactly where the journal indicated, hidden beneath a tangle of fallen logs and overgrown brush. The entrance was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and the darkness beyond seemed to swallow their flashlight beams. "Last chance to turn back," Jake said, though he knew he couldn't stop now. Sarah surprised him by going first, disappearing into the narrow opening with only a brief hesitation. Jake followed, the journal safely secured in his waterproof backpack, along with the blueprint and his grandfather's tools. The tunnel sloped sharply downward, the walls showing clear evidence of both natural cave formation and deliberate human excavation. After 20 minutes of careful progress, they emerged into a vast underground chamber that took their breath away. The cavern stretched beyond their flashlight range, but what they could see defied explanation. Ancient stone structures rose from the cave floor, their architecture unlike anything Jake had ever encountered. And at the center of it all, a massive crystalline formation pulsed with a faint, otherworldly light. "Now I understand," Jake whispered, finally grasping the true scope of his grandfather's secret. He wasn't just protecting a building technique, he was protecting this. The ancient symbols carved into the cabin's foundation stones seemed to pulse in the flickering light of Jake's flashlight. He traced his fingers along the weathered marks, feeling the rough granite beneath his fingertips as he compared them to the sketches in his grandfather's journal. Each symbol matched perfectly, confirming what he'd begun to suspect. This wasn't just any construction technique. It was something far older and more dangerous than he'd imagined. "These aren't construction marks," Maya whispered, crouching beside him in the cramped crawl space beneath the cabin. "They're warnings." Jake's stomach clenched as he read his grandfather's translation notes aloud. "Beware the sleeper beneath. The old ways demand balance. What is taken must be returned." He looked up at Maya, whose face had gone pale in the ghostly light. "What did my grandfather find down here?" A sudden crash from above made them both freeze. Footsteps thundered across the cabin floor, heavy and deliberate. Jake clicked off his flashlight, plunging them into complete darkness. His heart hammered against his ribs as he heard voices. At least 3 men, maybe more. "Find that journal," a gruff voice commanded. "And the blueprints. Garrett wants everything Blackwood left behind." Jake's blood turned to ice. Garrett, the man who'd been pressuring him to sell the cabin, who'd seemed to know more about his grandfather's work than he'd let on. The pieces were falling into place, but Jake still didn't understand what they were really after. Maya's hand found his in the darkness, her grip tight with fear. They needed to get out, but the only exit from the crawl space was a narrow opening that led directly into the cabin's main room, where their pursuers were now systematically destroying everything in their path. Jake fumbled for his grandfather's journal, pressing it against his chest. Whatever secrets it contained, people were willing to kill for them. The construction technique wasn't just ancient, it was connected to something that threatened powerful people. "Check the foundation," another voice ordered. The old man was obsessed with those carvings. He must have hidden something down there. Jake's mind raced. There had to be another way out. He remembered his grandfather's stories about the mountain caves, how they connected in an intricate network beneath the ridge. If the cabin had been built using ancient techniques, maybe it connected to those caves. Moving carefully in the darkness, Jake felt along the far wall of the crawl space. His fingers found what felt like a crack in the stone. No, not a crack, a seam. He pressed against it, and a section of the wall shifted slightly. "Here," he breathed in Maya's ear. "Help me push." Together, they applied pressure to the hidden panel. It gave way with a grinding sound that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space. Cool air rushed through the opening, carrying the musty scent of deep earth and old stone. Above them, the footsteps stopped. "Did you hear that?" one of the men asked. "Probably just the building settling." "Keep looking." Jake squeezed through the narrow opening first, then helped Maya follow. They found themselves in a natural cave passage, rough-hewn walls disappearing into blackness ahead. Jake risked turning on his flashlight for just a moment, keeping the beam low. The passage stretched deeper into the mountain, carved by centuries of water flow. As they moved away from the cabin, Jake's mind worked furiously to process what he'd learned. His grandfather hadn't just discovered an ancient building technique, he'd found something that threatened modern interests. The symbols weren't just decorative, they were part of a system, a warning about something sleeping beneath the mountain. "Jake," Maya whispered urgently, "look." She was pointing to the cave wall where more symbols had been carved into the living rock. These were different from the ones at the cabin, older, deeper, almost primitive in their execution. Jake consulted his grandfather's journal, finding sketches that matched. "The deeper signs," he read from his grandfather's notes, "mark the true danger. Not the technique itself, but what it awakens. The old builders knew. They tried to warn us." A distant rumble echoed through the mountain, so low Jake felt it in his bones rather than heard it. Dust rained from the cave ceiling, and somewhere far below, something seemed to stir. Maya grabbed his arm. "We need to get out of here, now." But as they turned to leave, Jake realized the terrible truth. His grandfather hadn't just been protecting an ancient secret, he'd been standing guard over it. The construction technique wasn't just about building, it was about containing something that had been deliberately buried. And by restoring the cabin, by disturbing the ancient foundations, Jake might have already begun to wake it up. The journal felt heavy in his hands as another rumble shook the mountain. Whatever his grandfather had died protecting was stirring, and Jake was running out of time to understand how to stop it. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the forest as Jake pressed his back against the cabin's outer wall, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the window he could see flashlight beams dancing across the interior, at least 3 figures moving through his grandfather's sanctuary with methodical precision. Sarah crouched beside him, clutching the journal to her chest. "How did they find us so fast?" she whispered, her breath visible in the cold mountain air. Jake's mind raced. They'd been careful, taking back roads and checking for tails. Unless... the blueprint, he breathed. They must have been monitoring anyone who accessed those old records downtown. A crash from inside made them both flinch. Jake peered around the corner and saw one of the intruders sweep a pile of his grandfather's tools off the workbench. The man wore all black, his face obscured by a ski mask, but his movements were deliberate, practiced. This wasn't random vandalism. "Where is it?" The voice carried through the broken front door, gravelly, impatient. The old man had to have left more than just fragments. Jake's blood ran cold. They weren't just here for the blueprint. They knew about his grandfather's discoveries, knew there was more to uncover. The journal in Sarah's arms suddenly felt heavier, more dangerous. "Check the basement again," another voice commanded. "Those symbols on the foundation stones, there has to be a connection." Jake grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her away from the cabin, staying low as they moved toward the tree line. Behind them, more glass shattered. They were destroying everything, erasing decades of his grandfather's work. 50 yards into the forest, Jake stopped behind a massive pine tree. From here, he could still see the cabin, but they were safely hidden in shadow. Sarah was trembling, whether from cold or fear, he couldn't tell. "We can't just let them destroy everything," Jake whispered fiercely. "Grandpa spent his whole life protecting whatever's in there." "Jake, these aren't kids playing pranks. They broke down the door like it was paper." Sarah's eyes were wide in the moonlight. "Someone died for this secret. Your grandfather knew people would kill for it." A new voice drifted from the cabin, clearer than the others. "The journal's not here. Search the surrounding area. They couldn't have gotten far on foot." Jake felt his stomach drop. They'd been seen, but how? Then he remembered the car parked on the old logging road. Of course they'd spotted it. Now they were trapped between the cabin and the only way back to civilization. "The cave system," Jake whispered suddenly. Grandpa's journal mentioned caves. If this building technique is really ancient, maybe there are other sites, other clues. Sarah looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "You want to go spelunking while armed men hunt us through the forest?" "I want to find out what's worth killing for before someone else dies for it." Jake pulled out his phone, using the dim screen light to examine his grandfather's hand-drawn map. "Look, there are markings here, about half a mile northeast. Symbols that match what I saw on the foundation stones." A flashlight beam swept dangerously close to their hiding spot. Jake clicked off his phone and pressed deeper into the shadow of the tree. Sarah's breathing was shallow, controlled. "This is insane," she breathed, but Jake could hear the shift in her voice. She was considering it. "My grandfather left me that cabin for a reason. He hid the blueprint where only I would find it. Whatever secret he was protecting, he trusted me to decide what to do with it." Jake met her eyes in the darkness. "I won't let it die with him." The flashlight beam moved away, but they could hear boots crunching through the underbrush, getting closer. Multiple sets now, they were spreading out, creating a search perimeter. Sarah clutched the journal tighter. "If we do this, if we go deeper into the mountains instead of running for help, there's no going back. We'll be completely on our own." Jake thought about the cryptic entries in his grandfather's journal, the building technique that defied modern understanding, the fear in the old man's eyes during their last conversation. Some secrets were worth preserving, worth fighting for. "Then we better make sure we find answers worth the risk." Sarah nodded slowly, resolution replacing fear in her expression. "Northeast, half a mile. But we move fast and quiet." They slipped deeper into the forest, leaving the destroyed cabin behind. Jake's last glimpse showed dark figures silhouetted against the broken windows, still searching for secrets they didn't understand. But Jake was beginning to comprehend the magnitude of what his grandfather had protected. Whatever lay hidden in those mountain caves, it was older than the cabin, more dangerous than he'd imagined, and now their only hope for survival. The sound of approaching vehicles cut through the mountain air like a death knell. Jake pressed himself against the cabin's newly reinforced wall, feeling the strange vibration that had been growing stronger since they'd completed the foundation work. The ancient technique his grandfather had hidden in the blueprints was working. He could sense it in the way the timber seemed to hum with life, the way shadows fell differently around the structure. 3 trucks, maybe 4, Maya whispered from her position by the window. "They're not trying to hide anymore." Jake's fingers traced the leather cover of his grandfather's journal, now worn smooth from constant handling. The final entries had become clearer as the cabin took shape, as if the building itself was unlocking the cryptic words. But there was still something missing, some crucial piece of the puzzle that would explain why people were willing to kill for these secrets. "The cellar," he said suddenly. "Grandpa mentioned it 17 times in the last month of entries, but we never found one." Sarah looked up from where she'd been loading the rifle they'd taken from Vance's men. "There has to be something we missed. Buildings like this always had root cellars, especially in this climate." The sound of car doors slamming echoed up the mountainside. Jake counted at least 8 distinct thuds. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. The sun was already touching the western peaks, and according to the journal, whatever protection the completed cabin might offer would only manifest after sunset. "Maya, keep watch. Sarah, help me look for any sign of a cellar entrance." Jake dropped to his hands and knees, running his palms across the floorboards. The journal had mentioned that the ancient building technique created resonances, connections between different parts of the structure that modern construction couldn't achieve. He pressed his ear to the floor and knocked systematically. Most of the sounds were solid, dead, but near the fireplace, where they discovered the first hidden compartment, his knocking produced a distinctly hollow echo. "Here," he called, and Sarah rushed over with a crowbar. Together they pried up the floorboards, revealing a narrow stone staircase descending into darkness. "Movement on the trail," Maya hissed. "They're about 10 minutes out, moving carefully." Jake grabbed a flashlight and started down the stairs, Sarah close behind. The cellar was larger than he'd expected, carved directly from the mountain stone, but it wasn't empty. Shelves lined the walls, filled with glass jars containing what looked like different types of soil, stone fragments, and dried plants. In the center of the room stood a wooden table covered with papers, maps, and what appeared to be geological surveys. "Jesus," Sarah breathed, scanning the documents. "Jake, these surveys show mineral deposits, underground water sources, ley lines. Your grandfather wasn't just building a cabin, he was building on a nexus point." The pieces suddenly clicked into place. The mysterious construction technique wasn't just about building methods, it was about harnessing the natural energy of the land itself. That's why Vance's corporation was so desperate to acquire this property. They weren't after the cabin or even the building's secrets. They were after what lay beneath it. "Rare earth minerals," Jake read from one of the surveys. "Lithium deposits, underground aquifer access." His grandfather had discovered a geological gold mine, literally worth millions. But instead of exploiting it, he'd built the cabin using techniques that would protect and preserve the natural balance. Heavy footsteps on the cabin floor above made them both freeze. They'd run out of time. "There's another way out," Sarah whispered, pointing to what looked like a natural cave opening at the far end of the cellar. These mountain caves often connect to multiple exits. Jake grabbed the most important-looking documents and stuffed them into his jacket. As they moved toward the cave entrance, he noticed symbols carved into the stone archway, the same symbols from the blueprint margins. His grandfather hadn't just been preserving mining rights or protecting the environment, he'd been guarding something far older, something that predated modern understanding of how energy moved through the earth. The cave passage was tight but navigable, clearly used for decades as an escape route. Behind them, they could hear voices in the cellar, someone cursing as they discovered the scattered papers. Jake and Sarah emerged from a concealed opening about 50 yards from the cabin, hidden behind a natural rock formation. From their new vantage point, they could see Vance himself directing his men, his face twisted with frustration. The cabin stood between him and everything he wanted, and as the last light faded from the sky, Jake felt the structure's energy signature change. The humming grew stronger, more focused. Whatever his grandfather had built, it was about to reveal its true purpose, and Jake finally understood why some secrets were worth dying to protect. Maya's voice crackled through the radio Sarah had grabbed. "They're inside, but something's wrong. The walls, they're starting to glow." The ancient stones beneath Jake's hands vibrated with an energy that seemed to pulse through his very bones. As he positioned the final keystone according to his grandfather's blueprint, the foundation began to emit a low, harmonic hum that resonated through the mountain itself. Sarah stepped back, her eyes wide with wonder and fear as the ground around the cabin started to glow with an ethereal blue light. "Jake, what's happening?" she whispered, but her voice was nearly drowned out by the increasing intensity of the sound. The journal pages in Jake's pocket grew warm against his chest, and he could feel the weight of generations pressing down upon him. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind, "And the mountain chooses its guardians, and the guardians choose their moment." This was that moment. He could feel it in every fiber of his being. Marcus Blackwood's men had surrounded the cabin, their flashlights cutting through the growing darkness like accusatory fingers. But something was wrong with their approach. The closer they got to the glowing perimeter, the more their equipment began to malfunction. Radios crackled with static, flashlights dimmed and died, and their GPS devices spun wildly before going dark. "Sir, we're experiencing some kind of electromagnetic interference," one of the men reported through his failing radio. "All our electronics are down." Blackwood's voice crackled back, distorted and angry. "I don't care if you have to use torches and smoke signals. Get me that blueprint." Jake pressed his hands against the final stone, feeling the ancient construction technique his grandfather had hidden in the blueprint coming to life beneath his touch. The stones weren't just building materials, they were conduits, channels for something far older and more powerful than modern science could explain. The mountain itself was awakening. Sarah grabbed his arm as the cabin began to transform around them. The walls that Jake had so carefully restored according to the ancient blueprint started to shift and reconfigure themselves, revealing hidden chambers and passages that hadn't been seen in decades. The air shimmered with possibilities, and Jake realized that his grandfather hadn't just built a cabin, he had created a fortress. The journal in his pocket grew almost too hot to bear, and Jake pulled it out, watching as new words began to appear on the pages in his grandfather's familiar handwriting. "To Guardian's final test approaches. Trust in the mountain's wisdom, and it will protect what matters most." Through the transformed windows, Jake could see Blackwood's men struggling against an invisible barrier that seemed to repel them with each step they took toward the cabin. Their leader, a tall man with cold eyes that Jake recognized from his nightmares, was shouting orders that his subordinates could barely hear over the mountain's growing song. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, but even as she spoke, she seemed drawn to the mysterious energy surrounding them. "This isn't natural, Jake. This is something else entirely." Jake shook his head, understanding flooding through him with sudden clarity. "No, Sarah. This is exactly what my grandfather intended. He didn't just hide a construction technique, he preserved something ancient, something that Blackwood and his organization have been trying to destroy for generations." The blueprint in Jake's other hand began to glow, its lines rearranging themselves to show not just the cabin structure, but an entire network of similar sites scattered across the mountain range. His grandfather had been part of something much larger, a group of guardians tasked with protecting knowledge that predated modern civilization. Outside, Blackwood himself had arrived, his expensive suit looking ridiculous in the mountain wilderness. He stood at the edge of the glowing perimeter, his face twisted with rage and something that looked like fear. Jake could see him shouting, but the mountain's protective barrier muffled his words into meaningless noise. The stones beneath the cabin continued their harmonic resonance, and Jake felt himself becoming part of something eternal and unbreakable. The construction technique wasn't just about building structures, it was about creating connections between the human world and forces that most people had forgotten existed. Sarah's hand found his, and together they watched as the cabin completed its transformation. What had been a simple mountain retreat was now revealed as a sophisticated sanctuary, equipped with hidden passages, concealed storage areas, and defensive mechanisms that operated on principles far beyond conventional engineering. The journal's pages continued to fill with his grandfather's posthumous guidance, Enter Mountain has accepted you, Jake. But acceptance comes with responsibility. The knowledge you now possess must be protected, shared only with those who understand its true purpose. Through the shimmering barrier, Jake could see Blackwood making frantic phone calls, probably summoning reinforcements with specialized equipment designed to overcome whatever was protecting the cabin. But Jake no longer felt the paralyzing fear that had driven him for weeks. The Mountain had chosen him, just as it had chosen his grandfather before him. The ancient stones pulsed with renewed energy, and Jake realized that the real battle was just beginning. Blackwood would return with greater force, but now Jake had something his enemy could never possess: the Mountain's trust and the wisdom of generations who had guarded these secrets. The transformation was complete, and Jake was no longer just a teenager trying to restore his grandfather's cabin. He was a guardian, and he was ready to fight. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the mountain air as Jake pressed his back against the cabin's reinforced door. His hands trembled as he clutched his grandfather's journal, the ancient blueprint folded carefully between its weathered pages. Outside, footsteps crunched through the snow in a deliberate circle around the structure. "You can't hide in there forever, boy." Blackwood's voice cut through the night like a blade. "We know what you've found." Jake's breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as he peered through the narrow window. 3 dark figures moved between the trees, their flashlight beams dancing across the cabin's walls. The construction he'd completed using his grandfather's mysterious techniques had held firm so far, but he could hear them testing the foundations, looking for weaknesses. The journal felt heavy in his hands as he flipped to the final entry, written in his grandfather's increasingly shaky handwriting. The words had haunted him since he'd first read them weeks ago, but now they carried new weight. The old ways are more than building techniques. They're protection against those who would abuse what lies beneath. A metallic scraping sound made Jake freeze. They were trying to pry off the window boards he'd reinforced with the interlocking joint system. The ancient technique his grandfather had preserved in the blueprint created bonds stronger than modern fasteners, but Jake wasn't sure it would withstand a sustained assault. His phone had lost signal hours ago when the storm had rolled in. Sarah and his uncle were somewhere down the mountain, believing he was safely tucked away for the night. They had no idea that Jake's restoration of the cabin had triggered something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The scraping stopped, replaced by hushed voices Jake couldn't quite make out. He crept toward the back of the cabin, where his grandfather had built a small storage room using the same mysterious joinery. According to the journal, this room held the real secret, the reason the mountain had been abandoned by the indigenous people centuries ago, and why certain families had been tasked with keeping it hidden. Jake's fingers found the concealed panel his grandfather had described. The wood seemed to recognize his touch, sliding away to reveal a narrow passage that descended into darkness. The journal had been vague about what lay below, mentioning only that some discoveries were too dangerous for the modern world. A loud crash from the front room told Jake his time had run out. They'd found a way through his defenses. He grabbed the emergency flashlight from the storage shelf and squeezed into the passage, pulling the panel closed behind him just as heavy footsteps entered the cabin above. The tunnel was older than anything Jake had seen in the blueprint, carved directly from the mountain stone with tools that predated European settlement. His flashlight beam revealed symbols etched into the walls, similar to those he'd found in the margins of his grandfather's journal, but far more elaborate. Behind him, muffled voices argued about where he could have gone. Jake pressed deeper into the passage, following a gentle downward slope that seemed to lead toward the heart of the mountain. The air grew warmer as he descended, and he began to hear something that made his blood run cold, a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. The passage opened into a natural cavern lit by an eerie phosphorescent glow. Jake's flashlight wasn't needed here. The walls themselves provided illumination through some mineral deposit he couldn't identify, but it wasn't the light that stopped him in his tracks. It was what the light revealed. Massive stone structures filled the cavern, built using techniques that made his grandfather blueprint seem primitive by comparison. The buildings defied conventional engineering, with stones that appeared to flow into each other like liquid, creating joints so seamless they looked like single pieces of rock. The humming sound was stronger here, and Jake realized it was coming from the structures themselves. His grandfather's journal had mentioned energy sources that modern science couldn't explain, technologies that indigenous peoples had deemed too dangerous to use. Looking at the impossible architecture before him, Jake began to understand why some secrets had been worth dying to protect. A sound from the tunnel behind him made Jake spin around. Flashlight beams were approaching, and Blackwood's voice echoed off the stone walls with new urgency. They knew about the passage, which meant they'd been planning this for longer than Jake had realized. He looked around the cavern desperately, searching for another way out or somewhere to hide. The humming from the stone structures was growing louder, and Jake noticed that the symbols on the walls were beginning to glow more brightly. Something about his presence, or perhaps the presence of intruders, was activating systems that had slept for centuries. Jake clutched the journal tighter and made a decision that would have terrified him days ago. If his grandfather's blueprint had been just the beginning, then maybe these ancient structures held the real answers he needed. The ancient support beam groaned overhead as another explosion rocked the mountainside, sending dust cascading from the cabin's reinforced ceiling. Jake pressed his back against the stone wall his grandfather had built, using the mysterious technique, feeling the vibrations travel through rock that should have crumbled decades ago, but instead held firm against the chaos above. "They're getting closer," Sarah whispered, clutching the leather journal against her chest. Her face was streaked with dirt, but her eyes burned with determination. "How much longer do you need?" Jake wiped sweat from his forehead as he positioned the final cornerstone into place. The blueprint spread across the floor showed intricate markings that had taken him weeks to decipher, but now the pattern was clear. His grandfather hadn't just built a cabin, he'd created a fortress designed to protect something far more valuable than anyone had imagined. 5 more minutes, he muttered, running his hands along the carved symbols that matched those in the journal. "The keystone has to align perfectly, or the whole system fails." Another blast shook the cabin, and through the reinforced windows, Jake could see flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. Marcus Blackwood's men had found them, just as his grandfather's final journal entry had warned they would. The old man's words echoed in Jake's mind. "The mountain remembers everything, and some secrets are worth dying to protect." Sarah moved to the window, peering through a gap in the heavy shutters. "I count at least 8 of them. They've got explosives and they're not afraid to use them." She turned back to Jake, her voice steady despite the danger. "Tell me again why we couldn't just turn this over to the authorities." Jake's hands never stopped working as he spoke, fitting stone against stone with the precision his grandfather had taught him through months of cryptic lessons disguised as simple construction projects. Because Blackwood owns half the authorities in 3 counties, and because what's hidden here isn't just about my family, it's about preserving something that could change how we understand the indigenous peoples who lived here centuries before any of us. The beam overhead creaked again, but Jake recognized the sound now. It wasn't the groan of failing wood. It was the ancient timber responding to the pressure changes as the hidden chamber below began to seal itself. The construction technique wasn't just about building strong walls, it was about creating a living system that could protect itself. A sharp crack from outside made them both freeze. Then came Blackwood's voice, amplified by a megaphone and dripping with false reasonableness. "Jacob, you're making this far more difficult than necessary. Your grandfather was a stubborn old fool, but you don't have to die for his mistakes. Bring me the blueprint and the journal, and we can all walk away from this." Jake's jaw tightened as he slotted the penultimate stone into position. Through the journal, he'd learned the truth about his grandfather's relationship with Blackwood, how they'd once been partners in archaeological excavation, until grandfather discovered what Blackwood really wanted from the mountain, not historical preservation, but exploitation. The ancient techniques weren't just construction methods, they were part of a sacred system that had protected this land for generations. "One more stone," Jake whispered, lifting the keystone with trembling hands. It was heavier than the others, carved from a different type of rock that seemed to pulse with its own inner warmth. The symbols etched into its surface matched the final page of his grandfather's journal, the page written in Cherokee script that Sarah had helped him translate just hours earlier. The translation still gave him chills. "When the mountain's children return, the old ways will remember their purpose." A tremendous crash echoed from the cabin's front door. Blackwood's men had breached the outer defenses. Jake could hear boots on the wooden floor above, voices shouting as they searched room by room, but they were looking in the wrong place. The real secret had always been below, in the foundation chamber that only the completed blueprint could reveal. Jake pressed the keystone into its final position and felt something click deep within the mountain itself. The stones around them began to glow with a faint phosphorescence, and the air hummed with energy that seemed to rise from the earth below. The ancient building technique wasn't just about stacking rocks, it was about creating a harmonic resonance that connected the structure to the living mountain. Sarah gasped as the wall beside them began to shift, revealing a passage that led deeper into the mountain's heart. Cool air flowed from the opening, carrying scents of cedar and sage that spoke of ceremonies conducted in darkness centuries ago. "Time to go," Jake said, gathering the journal and blueprint. Above them, the footsteps were getting closer, and he could hear Blackwood's voice growing more urgent. But the mountain had awakened now, and Jake finally understood what his grandfather had spent his whole life protecting. As they stepped into the passage, the wall began to close behind them, sealing away the old world and leading them toward whatever lay in the mountain's deepest secrets. The ancient stones hummed with power as Jake pressed his palms against the restored foundation. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus Thornfield's arrest, but the cabin still felt alive in ways he couldn't explain. The blueprint's geometric patterns, now fully realized in timber and stone, created something far beyond a simple mountain retreat. Sarah emerged from the kitchen, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. The insurance adjuster called again. "They're still trying to figure out how a building this old could have sustained so little damage from the explosion." Jake accepted the mug gratefully, his hands still bearing faint scars from their desperate construction work. Maybe some things aren't meant to be explained. Through the restored windows, morning light filtered in geometric patterns that matched the blueprint's sacred symbols. The cabin felt complete now, not just repaired, but awakened. Every joint fitted perfectly, every stone settled into its destined place, creating a harmony that resonated in the very air. Sheriff Morrison's truck rumbled up the mountain road, dust trailing behind it like smoke. Jake watched him approach, noting how the man's shoulders had straightened in recent weeks. The corruption that had plagued the county for decades was finally being rooted out. "Morning, kids," Morrison called as he climbed the porch steps. "Thought you'd want to hear the latest on Thornfield." They settled into the handcrafted chairs Jake had built using techniques from his grandfather's journal. Morrison removed his hat, running weathered fingers through graying hair. Federal investigators found records going back 50 years. Thornfield Industries has been suppressing alternative building methods, buying patents, silencing inventors. Your grandfather wasn't their first victim, Jake, but he might be their last. Sarah leaned forward. What happens now? Thornfield's facing enough charges to keep him locked up for life. Corporate espionage, murder conspiracy, environmental cover-ups, the list keeps growing. But more importantly, the techniques in that journal are already spreading. Jake felt a warm satisfaction in his chest. 3 construction companies had already contacted him after word leaked about the cabin's unique building methods. The sustainable techniques his grandfather had died protecting were finally seeing daylight. Morrison stood to leave, then paused. "Your grandfather would be proud, son. He always said this place was meant for something special." As the sheriff drove away, Jake walked to the stone fireplace where his grandfather's journal rested in a place of honor. The leather cover was worn smooth from countless readings, its pages filled with wisdom that went far beyond construction techniques. "I've been thinking," Sarah said, joining him, "about what comes next." Jake turned to face her, seeing determination in her green eyes. Over the weeks of working together to restore the cabin, something had shifted between them. The shared danger and triumph had forged a connection deeper than friendship. "The university accepted my proposal," she continued. "They want to fund a research project on sustainable mountain architecture. I was hoping you'd consider being my partner." The offer hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Jake looked around the cabin, at the walls they'd raised together, at the stones that held centuries of secrets, at the home they'd created from his grandfather's dreams. "I've got a better idea," he said, pulling a rolled paper from the mantelpiece. "I found this in the journal's back cover yesterday." Sarah gasped as he unrolled another blueprint, more complex than the first. This one showed not just a single cabin, but an entire community designed around the ancient building principles. Sustainable homes that worked in harmony with the mountain's natural forces, connected by paths that followed the land's sacred geometry. "He planned a whole settlement," Jake whispered. "A place where these techniques could flourish, where people could live in balance with nature." Sarah traced the intricate designs with one finger. "It's incredible. But it would take years to build, millions of dollars. The insurance settlement on grandfather's original property will cover the land purchase. And with Thornfield Industries being liquidated, their mountain holdings are going up for auction. We could buy the entire valley." The magnitude of the vision struck them both silent. What had started as a desperate fight to save one cabin had evolved into something far grander, a chance to create a new model for sustainable living. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Jake smiled. The mountain's weather patterns had become familiar friends during their time here. He understood now why his grandfather had chosen this place, why the ancient builders had recognized its power. "So?" Jake asked, extending his hand to Sarah. "Ready to change the world?" She grasped his hand firmly, her smile bright as mountain sunshine. "Let's build something amazing." Outside, the first raindrops began to fall, but inside the restored cabin, two young architects began sketching plans for a future that honored the past while embracing tomorrow's possibilities. The blueprint's secrets were safe now, ready to transform the world one carefully placed stone at a time. The mountain itself seemed to approve, its ancient heart beating in rhythm with their dreams.